Initiation by Elisabeth Haich, Chapter 45. The Challenges Are Repeated. It was the last winter before the end of the war. Our gardener, who had taken care of our orchard, had long since been called up for military service. The orchard was forsaken, and I moved into our little forest house to save whatever I could. One night I was awakened by a horrible sound, sirens, in the city. I jumped out of bed. From the dining room I could see the city in the distance. Dozens and dozens of airplanes roared over my head in the darkness. The air trembled with the noise of their engines. Suddenly, a hellish drama began to be enacted in the air over the city as row after row of airplanes dropped their bombs into the masses of humanity living below. The sky came alight with the bursting of bombs and the fires they started throughout the city. The noise became deafening as, added to the roar of the engines and the bursting of the bombs, the city's anti-aircraft cannon began picking out targets overhead as best they could. Seen from a distance, their fire looked like tiny red lanterns climbing up into the sky. From time to time, I could see what looked like huge burning torch plunging downward, and I knew that somewhere a mother would be waiting in vain for her son to come home. This breathtaking show of fireworks continued for almost an hour and a half, and it seemed to me that I'd been standing at my window for an eternity of time. Down there in front of me, there, this interplay of lightning and thunder meant death and destruction for thousands of people. All my dear ones were living. All except my son, who at that very moment could perhaps be flying through the air as a target for other poor young men's flying in much better aircraft, forced to shoot at him against their human instincts, just as he was being forced to shoot at them. All at once I felt a force from a nearby tree calling in my direction. Looking towards the tree, I saw two green eyes staring at me. An owl. It sat there as immobile as a statue. Never before had I seen an owl in this whole area. How did it come here? Almost unconsciously, I spoke to it in spirit. You, dear bird, it's not your fault that superstitious people think of you as a harbinger of danger and death. Still, do you perhaps want to tell me that all my dear ones down there in the city are no longer living on this earth? Immediately the owl danced a little bit closer to me on the branch, and suddenly it spread its wings and it flew off into the forest. Instantly I knew that a great power which controls and guides everything was telling me through the disappearance of the death bird that all my dear ones were still alive. Yes, all my dear ones, but all the thousands of people who were killed that night in that city, and all the others who've been killed during this terrible war. Each such person was somebody's dear one. Why have these people to die? Why do people kill each other senselessly? The hellish drama was repeated night after night. In the summertime, several of us moved into our little house in the forest. Bogar came with us. During the nights of terror, we all stood together at the window, watching the bombardment of the city below. Shortly after the sirens gave the all-clear signal, my husband would telephone with the reassuring news that he and the others with him in our city house were all safe and sound. When autumn came, I stayed behind alone in our forest house, continuing my work in the orchard and garden. Each evening I was able to observe how much closer to us the enemy artillery, these poor young men who were forced into being our enemies, had moved up during the course of the day. One evening I decided I was going back to the city, come what might. I was determined to go through at the side of my loved ones the difficult hours of siege and bombardment that lay ahead. Then my telephone rang. How strange. I suddenly felt positive I'd already experienced the same situation some time before. I knew in advance that my husband was just now going to call me, and I knew word for word, what we were going to say to each other, and all the while I felt as if I were dreaming. And this strange, same feeling was to continue throughout all the difficult days to come, until the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, and the months into years. Again and again I found I knew exactly what was going to happen. The next moment, just as if I had already experienced all these terrible things, everything was simply repeated. I knew it, but I couldn't understand where and how I could have experienced these situations before. After I had returned to the city, and the sirens howling in the night forced me to join all the others in the house in a pell-mell fight into the cellar, and as we sat there, all of us calm, passive, earnest, and worried about what was going to happen next, all the while I knew that somehow, somewhere, I had experienced all this before. And so it was to be with me throughout the nights, the horrible nights of bombardments and air raids. I experienced this feeling of reliving past events even more strongly one day in late autumn when the door opened and my son came in. Why was I surprised to see him in an Air Force uniform? Yes, I remembered him as Ima, the young priest in Egypt, and I also knew all the relationships that linked us together, but in my memory of him in Egypt, he wore quite different clothing. How do I come to feel that even in my life in Egypt, I already saw him in this Air Force uniform? Why do I have the feeling that everything I experience is not reality, that I'm merely dreaming all these pictures, and that I'm experiencing these dreams in my initiation sleep in the Great Pyramid? I clearly remember all the relationships of my life in Egypt, but no matter how hard I try, I cannot remember the events nor my initiation dreams. How strange. How can one remember that one doesn't remember? If I can't remember something, then I cannot know that it has existed, but I know I experienced my whole future destiny in visions during my initiation in the pyramid, and that these visions, these dream pictures, were the occasion for my passing various tests and meeting certain challenges. It's true, my master Ptahhotep warned me that if I were to fall after initiation, all the tests I had gone through during my initiation would be repeated on the earthly plane. Yes, continually I have the feeling that these events are repeating themselves. For a number of years, I made a habit of writing down every morning as I was waking up the dreams I had had during the night. I had not reviewed these records for a whole year. Now I began to read them, and to my great surprise I found that most of these dreams I had recorded were dreams I had of events to come, events which I actually experienced later, sometimes as much as 6 months, or a year later. In the meantime, I had completely forgotten the dreams themselves, and if I had not been able to see and recognize my own handwriting, I would not have believed that I had dreamed these dreams and recorded them. How was it possible? When these things actually happened, I couldn't remember anymore that I dreamt them in advance, and in many cases, even in amazingly accurate detail. I found this discovery to be literally amazing. What kind of force is there within us that knows our future in advance with such precision and tells us about it beforehand? And what kind of imperfect creatures are we, who understand so little about the language of dreams that we can't remember having dreamed in advance about a certain event or situation, even when the dream is repeating itself on the earthly plane in our outward life? Truly, we don't deserve the care and the attention this force bestows upon us, as with infinite patience it reveals new truth and knowledge to us. How could I explain remembering from an earlier life in Egypt that I had seen my son in an Air Force uniform, and that when he came in I knew exactly I knew exactly he was going to take a leave of me because his unit was going to be transferred to an airfield less exposed to enemy bombing than the one near our city. As he spoke, and as I answered, I knew within me that I had experienced all this once before. Again, I had the feeling I was only dreaming. I didn't dare tell anyone of this experience. I was afraid that even my son, Ima himself, would believe my mind had suffered from all the excitement. It seemed much better to keep silent about the whole matter. And so we lived through the siege of our city. For 7 weeks, we sat in our cellar, enduring incessant bombings. After the house above us had been bombed and shelled into a heap of rubble, we were forced to flee. Our destiny tossed us about like a leaf in the wind, and after many trials and tribulations, we began to rebuild our lives. We were all reduced to the state of beggars. My husband had previously been injured, and it was a long time before he could work again. By dint of days and nights of effort, with no more equipment than primitive man had in his first primeval jungle, Bogar and I fashioned a new home out of the ruins of our family house, and in it we reopened our yoga school. Months went by as we worked hard and long. Those were times when we learned what hunger is. Week by week we gradually wasted away, shrinking from human beings of flesh and blood to living skeletons covered with skin. Even good friends would fail to recognize each other when they met by chance on the street. Fear, a baleful new fear, spread throughout the population, augmenting the feelings of fright already present in thousands of tortured souls. What will we eat tomorrow? How long will we be able to go on working so hard without even once getting enough to eat? How long can we go on like this and still maintain our health? The country's fertile soil had brought forth plenty of everything we needed, but we were forced to look on while countless freight trains snaked their way through the countryside, carrying off our rich harvest to another country. Then, after long and difficult months, even the famine began to abate. More and more frequently we got something nourishing to eat. And gradually we began to put on weight. Once again, good friends and acquaintances failed to recognize each other on the street. We had all gotten accustomed to seeing each other so thin and emaciated, and every so often in passing someone on the street, the thought would flash across our mind that this well-fed person bore a striking resemblance to some very thin person who was a friend. Both of us would have the same thought and then turn around, recognize each other, and break out in peals of laughter at the happy reunion. But months went by before we became really reacquainted with all our friends, reaccustomed to their normal dimensions. I still had the feeling that I had already experienced all of this. It was a feeling that stayed with me wherever I went, whatever I did. It was not that I could foretell the future. On the contrary, it was merely the persistent feeling that everything had already happened, just the same way once before. And, not being able to foresee the future, I did not know what had become of my son. Since the time he suddenly took leave of us, he had not been heard of. A year and a half later, the doorbell rang. I opened the door, and who should I see before me but my son? And once again, I had that strange feeling known by psychologists as the déjà vu. I knew it was a repetition. All these events were repetitious, but how could that be? And one night, everything became clear. Once, when I was forced to pass the test of cruel love towards the person I love most dearly here on earth, my son, I kneeled in my bed in the dark of the night and I talked about him with God, asking him, capital H, to show my son the way he should go. I followed the pathway which within us leads to God, withdrawing my consciousness from my outer person into my inner being. Finally, I fell into a trance, and suddenly I found myself in front of the 7 steps I have told about earlier. And I jump up from one to the next, easily, happily, joyously. I know the way. I remember, oh God, I remember all these events I've been experiencing as reality in my life on the material earthly plane. These are all things that I'd experienced several thousands of years ago in my initiation, in the pyramid. At that time, all these events were lying in the depths of my soul as unconscious, still latent energies, still pure cause. This is because everything happens here on earth is a materialization of the complete and accomplished cause, waiting on the spiritual plane for materialization. When one achieves the ability consciously to reach the depths of the self, where those energies are awaiting their realization, one experiences cause simultaneously with the effect, the future, as a complete and perfect present. And the present, our life, everything that happens to us is merely an opportunity to meet the tests and the trials and the challenges of initiation. An opportunity to relax the tensions and dissolve away any stresses that we have stored up within ourselves for eons and eons of time by our thoughts and words and deeds. The tensions and the stresses that are the cause of our destiny, our future, to the extent that we are able to become conscious of these tensions and overcome them, we free our human consciousness, which is tied down by these energies and limited because it is tied down, and we identify our consciousness with the true divine self waiting behind every personal feeling of ego. We identify ourselves with God, and that is initiation.